Welcome back to the Florida History Podcast. I'm Carter Krishnaiyer.
And I'm Robert Buccellato.
Robert, one of the most famous governors in the history of this state is Napoleon Bonaparte Broward. One of the most identifiable names, yet I think he is singularly famous now for the draining of the Everglades. But in reality, there's a lot more to him. He's a pretty complex character, and he was from Jacksonville. He had been the sheriff of Duval County. He had served in the state house. He was this kind of charismatic figure that had Teddy Roosevelt vibes, as you and I have talked about before, but also had the politics, like this weird combination of William Jennings Bryan populism and Grover Cleveland bourbonism, which Democrats at that time weren't really able to thread that needle, right? They were on one side, one faction of the party or the other, but Broward threaded that needle and was universally popular in the state at the time.
Well, good sir, you and me, we know quite a bit about the gentlemen who have been governors of Florida. And the one defining difference between those that leave office diminished and those that leave office on a good note, that were defined by the general public as a success story, can be defined by one simple fact. Did they or did they not win the Senate seat that they undoubtedly ran for after they were termed out of office? And in the case of Broward, he certainly did. He won his Senate seat. Only problem was he passed away before he got to do anything with it. But that is really the main thing that you can say about Broward as far as his standing in Florida politics, was that at the time when you got elected governor of Florida, that was it. Enjoy it, buddy, because in 4 years you were going to be back to nobody, and you weren't going to be able to get dog catcher unless Floridians thought for some reason you were one of the rare exceptions. You were a statesman who left the governorship and was ready for the prime time, in which case you run for the U.S. Senate, and if you were lucky and you won, you got it, and you got to keep playing in politics. But for the most part, once you were governor, that was it. After 4 years, the state didn't want to hear from you. Go back to trying to sell land or whatever you were doing before then. That was the end of your political career. With Broward, that didn't happen. He was able to remain a figure and a popular figure, and he was not diminished when he left the governorship. And that was because he was able to thread that needle. He was able to speak for all Floridians in a way that was dynamic, that was engaging, and he, more importantly, he was a figure of his time. He was swashbuckling the way that Teddy Roosevelt.
Right, and he had filibustered in Cuba. He had served.
Yeah, but he was sort of, he was. Teddy Roosevelt was an extraordinary man. Like, he was sort of a Teddy Roosevelt light. He was a ghost of Teddy Roosevelt, if you would. But no other Floridian has ever come as close to a Teddy Roosevelt figure as him. But at the same time, he was very much like a Jennings Bryan. He was very young. He was very energetic. He was very populist. He was, for the fighting poor. He was a man of action. He wasn't one of these bland, overfed Democratic governors that had come before him. He was dynamic. He was ready to make good. He was ready to build up this state. He was ready to develop it. He was primed. He was ready to go. He was a man of action. Now, another thing that you know of, and that I know of, because, we talked to a lot of these figures that knew Florida governors. We talked to a lot of people that voted and worked for Florida governors. There's a little game that we like to play, and that is Florida has never elected a U.S. president.
But the closest a Floridian has been to being nominated for vice president. I know Connie Mack was kind of close in '96. Bob Graham was kind of close in '92, maybe in 2000 also. But the closest was 1908, when, if it had been thrown open to the convention, if William Jennings Bryan had thrown it open to the convention, Napoleon Bonaparte Broward would have been on the Democratic ticket in 1908.
Absolutely. So, we like to say that, Andrew Jackson was our president because, he was, the kind of military governor for a few months of Florida. And now there's some of us that say, well, Donald Trump, he is a Florida resident, so, he's our president. But, I mean, if we're not cheating, we all know what we're talking about. Somebody that was born and raised and spent their entire political career in Florida, making good, going on, and being a national figure and being on the ticket. That's never happened. So there's a little game that we all like to play, some of us, where they're like, well, looking back at the guys that we've had, who was presidential timber? A lot of people that knew Dan McCarty, they swear up and down he would have been president. Ralph Turlington, the great Ralph Turlington, who, died at 101, who knew everybody. He swears up and down that the only two Democrats that he ever knew that had presidential timber was Dan McCarty and Reuben Askew. Well, I would agree with that assessment, but I would add another name. Another two names, and I would say that Bob Graham and Governor Broward are the two great vice presidential candidates that we never had in this country.
So, unfortunately, we are not able to talk about Governor Broward as a VP nominee because William Jennings Bryan strategically decided to pick a Midwesterner instead of letting the convention decide. And then once he's elected to the Senate, beating the Democratic incumbent in the primary, and he died before taking his seat. So we can talk about what this life might have been for him in the U.S. Senate, how influential he might have been in the Senate, because he was a national figure. He was the first genuinely national figure from the state of Florida, but we'll never know.
And it should also be mentioned, when people talk about William Jennings Bryan, they think about, his hometown, his home state, in the Midwest. But he was a Florida man for a long time.
Yeah.
He had aspirations for that U.S. Senate.
And in fact, as our listeners remember, we did a podcast on his daughter, who became a congresswoman. She was our first female elected from Florida to Congress. She became a congresswoman from Miami, right? Or Coral Gables is where the Bryan family relocated.
Yeah, absolutely. So Broward was a rival for him, for his adopted home state of Florida in a way. So you could even make the argument that had Broward been from North Carolina or Georgia or Tennessee, he would have said, "Oh yeah, just whatever the primary, whatever the convention wants." But he could have, it's not a far off thought to think that he was denying Broward this nomination because he was trying to handicap a potential rival, which Broward was a very young man, people. Nobody thought for a second that he would die as young as he died.
Yep.
was another tragic figure, like an Ocean B. Hart, like a Dan McCarty, who, I mean, he died in his absolute prime. He was at the absolute height of his political powers. And when I say political powers, I'm not talking about his influence. I'm talking about his ability to connect with voters. We never saw the absolute most that Broward could deliver. It would have been extraordinary. I mean, we had a potential here for him to be one of the leaders of the U.S. Senate, or, as I said, a vice president. It didn't happen because of this tragic streak that we had in the 20th century, where we had these figures, like I said, like a Broward, like a Dan McCarty, where, they're at their peak and they just get mowed down by some random illness. So it was a great loss. And every single thing from the time that he was a sheriff in Jacksonville, and there was, a tuberculosis outbreak, and he and every other elected official left except for him, and he was effectively the community sheriff, health official, mayor, whatever. He was the only one that stayed and was running that city all the way up to when he was a governor, and he was trying to develop as well as find conservation methods in the Everglades, all the way to when he was trying to bring his mix of bourbon Democrat and populist Democrat to a national ticket. He had the goods. He had the game. He could have gone the distance. And again, it's one of those odd things with Florida, I don't know why, where we just have the worst luck. When all the numbers are matching, when all the buttons are clicking, it just doesn't work out for us. You can even make the case that when it comes to Donald Trump, things started going sour with him when he switched his residency from New York to Florida. I don't know what it is. We just, whereas every child that is born in Ohio, their parents look at them and they say, that's presidential timber. When any child that is born in Minnesota, the parents look at them and they say, that's vice presidential timber. Every child born in Florida, parents look at them and they think, God, I hope they don't fight a crocodile. I don't know what it is, but when it comes to the presidency, when it comes to the White House, Florida is always, left hanging. We don't have a seat at the table.
So I think it's important we talk about Broward's very negative environmental legacy before we leave this show, Robert, because the decision, and obviously Broward County is named for him for a reason, the decision to wholesale drain the Everglades, a lot of the revisionism about this is that, well, we didn't know the environmental consequences at the time. And while we didn't know the extent of environmental consequences at the time, I do think it was pretty clear that draining the Everglades was going to have a problem. Was going to create problems for the ecosystem, and there was an unchallenged amount of plume bird hunting and that sort of thing going on in the Everglades to where birds were being hunted close to extinction. You had a game warden, Guy Bradley, the famous Guy Bradley. If you want to know more about his life, there's a fictionalized version where he is, or the character resembling him is played by Christopher Plummer, 1958 movie Wind Over the Everglades. But in real life, Bradley got killed. He got killed by a poacher. And the bourbon Democrats, we said Broward had tried to thread the needle, but the bourbon Democrats that Broward represented partly, right, and populist were the other half of that coalition, considered the Everglades a useless swamp. They didn't understand things like native habitats. They didn't understand the ecology. They didn't understand preserving the ecosystem. They didn't understand or care about how draining it would relate to the water table. And he had oppositions. He had opposition at the time about what was going on with the Everglades, and you had newspaper editors challenging him, including Frank Stoneman, very famous last name, and we'll obviously talk about Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. We've talked about her previous shows. We'll talk about her again. Opposing this, and this is also where the Teddy Roosevelt comparison comes in, because Roosevelt, for all the lauding of him as an environmentalist, and he had declared the nation's first national wildlife refuge. The National Wildlife Refuge System started in Florida. Pelican Island was the first national wildlife refuge in Indian River County. Before anything out west was declared a national wildlife refuge. Obviously, national parks started in the west, so let's concede that. But the refuge system actually started in the east. It started in Florida, and there was the concern about bird hunting, plume hunting. But Roosevelt actually embraced this and supported Broward with this. There was a feeling among maybe more educated people that were not solely driven by business interests, that this was not a good idea. This was not good for society. So, and not good for the state of Florida, and not good for the natural balance that had been provided in the state of Florida. So the idea that Broward didn't know what he was doing with that, and that it was okay, the draining of the Everglades in the industrial fashion it was undertaken under Governor Broward is absolute bunk, and that's something I just can't abide by. I know there's a lot of controversy about the governor's views on race. Quite frankly, those were mainstream opinions in the ruling class in Florida at the time. But I did want to address, and I'm not condoning that, obviously, but we don't condone that stuff on this podcast, Robert. But I did want to point out that the revisionism about the drainage of the Everglades has been something that has been like this asterisk on Broward, where, okay, yes, we concede he drained the Everglades, but he didn't really know what he was doing, and it was progress. So that I think the industrial and intensive fashion of it was not without opposition and not without critique during that decade. Anyway, we'll be back next week with another Florida History podcast.